Hi, my name is McKenzie from Beek. In this video, I am comparing the lamprey, the dogfish shark, and the mud puppy. You'll be learning about the differences and similarities between the gills and the integument between all three species. And you'll also be learning the differences and similarities between the anterior muscles of the dogfish shark and the mud puppy. I hope you enjoy.
Here we're going to be talking about the integument of lamprey. We're going to start with the epidermis. There's three different types of cells within the epidermis. There are these elongated club cells. These are responsible for secreting chemicals to alert other fish. There's also these large glandular cells in the upper half that secrete substances like hormones. And lastly, there are many small mucus cells all over the epidermis. They're obviously secreting large amounts of mucus on the surface of the skin to keep it moist. There's also, you can tell that there's no epidermal scales. And then we're going to talk about the dermis. The dermis is very thin compared to the epidermis. It contains connective tissue and pigments, and it attaches to the fatty subcutaneous layer. This video is about the integument of sharks. We're going to talk right away about the epidermis, and right off the bat you can tell there is no keratinized layer. This is because sharks are aquatic animals just like lampreys, so you won't see a keratinized layer in either of them because it's not necessary. Also, the epidermis of the shark is extremely thinner compared to the dermis. It consists of stratified epithelium and scattered mucus cells. There's far fewer mucus cells than that of the lamprey, and there's also cells that produce toxins for the fin spines. As for the dermis is far thicker than that compared to the epidermis. This is the opposite of lamprey, so lampreys are going to have a thick epidermis and a thin dermis, while these have thin epidermis, thick dermis. In the dermis, there is blood vessels, connective tissue, and pigment cells. This is located in the subcutaneous layer of the lamprey. There's also placoid scales that are embedded in the dermis. Both the mud puppy nor the lamprey have these structures, so neither of them have scales. The shark scales are embryonically derived from the dermis and the epidermis. They consist of a bony base with a bone-like material, dentin and enamel. This last video about integument is going to be on the mud puppy. We're going to start by talking about the epidermis, which lies right here. Zooming in here, you're able to see this keratinized layer. This helps keep in water and moisture because it is a terrestrial animal. Neither the shark nor the lamprey had this because they are both aquatic and it wasn't necessary for them. The skin of the mud puppy also acts as a respiratory organ. So there's going to be a lot of mucus glands scattered around here, many of them as you keep going across. This helps keeps the skin moist, aiding in that respiration. There's also going to be these poison glands. These sit in the dermis, but they originate in the epidermis. Their job is to secrete harmful toxins. And lastly, the epidermis is much thinner than that of the dermis, similar to the shark. The dermis of the mud puppy, like I said, is thick like a shark's, and it is stratified. It consists of connective tissue and collagen fibers and blood vessels. And here you can see these chromatophores. These are the pigment cells of the dermis within the shark, and they're similar to that of the lamprey. Also, a note here is that the mucus cells bases sit in the dermis, while they also still originate with the epidermis.
In this video, we are comparing the axial epibronchial muscles of the dogfish shark to the mud puppy. So the dogfish shark, the epaxial muscles consist of myomeres and myosepta. If you see up here, the myomeres are the muscle blocks and the myosepta are the connective tissue in between. They're a little bit lighter than the muscle blocks. It goes from the head to the tip of the tail, so it goes along its whole trunk, starting up by the head. And the myomeres and muscle blocks are in the apexial region that aid in the smooth locomotion of the shark. As for the mud puppy, the apexial muscles consist of doralis trunci, where it extends from the head also to the tip of the tail, like the shark. And similar to that of the shark, they also have myomeres and myosepta, so the muscle blocks in the connective tissue. The apexial musculature of the two is homologous. In this video, we're going to be comparing the axial hypobronchial muscles of the dogfish shark to the mud puppy. The dogfish shark has a coracomandibularus, which would be located right here. So, yep, right there. It is a muscle that is strap-like and extends from the area of the pectoral girdle to the lower jaw. Sharks also have coracohyoids, which is going to be on either side of the coracomandibularus. So it's this guy right here. There's another one on this side. You just can't see it. They are paired strap-like muscles that assist in depressing the lower jaw, like the coracomandibular. And lastly, they also have what's called coracoid bronchial muscles. Those help depress the lower jaw and stabilize the pericardial cavity. That's more of a deep muscle, so that's underneath the coracoid mandibularis. As for the mud puppy, it has the glenohyoids, which is homologous to the shark's coracomandibular. That is this kind of flap here underneath. That's so sad. The axial hypobronchial muscles of the mud puppy consist of the intermandibularis, which is this on this flap. It is the more superior part, so up here more. There's also the interhyoides, which is inferior on the lower part of that flap. There's also the geniohyoides, which is these two bands running along here. It's a slender band lying dorsal to the intermandibularis and the interhyoides, and it helps depress the lower jaw. The genioglossus is in here more, right in here. And that is also homologous to the coracoid mandibular, and it aids in moving the tongue. There's also the rectus abdominis, which is more of the abdominal muscles. Those help retract the hyoid and the gill apparatus, as well as depressing the head. It's homologous to the coracoid hyoid and the coracoarticulo muscles of the shark. And a note is that you can see there are a lot of similarities in these axial muscles within the mud puppy and the shark. In this video, we're going to be comparing the visceral brachiomeric muscles of the dogfish shark and the mud puppy. One of the shark's visceral muscles is the adductor mandibulae, which would lie right here. It is what helps close its jaw, and it's a large globular muscle at the angle of the jaw underneath here. Next is the levator pella quadri, is a muscle that elevates the upper jaw and is located anterior to the spiracle, so about right here. The intermandibularis muscles are underneath. They're right here. Their job is to elevate the floor of the mouth, which reduces the volume of the oral cavity. The muscle that compresses the gill pouches is the interhyoides, which is the piece of muscle that was removed from this area, which will be over here on this side. It is dorsal to the intermandibular. The dorsal constrictors are back over here. They're responsible for elevating the upper jaw, while the ventral constrictors are to elevate the floor of the mouth, reducing the volume of the oral cavity. So the two parts of that is the levator mandibulae, which is going to be above, right here, above the adductor mandibulae, and the levator hyoides is going to be about here. And lastly, the cucullaris is the muscle responsible for elevating the scapular process, and that is going to be located up here. Now we're going to talk about the visceral brachiomeric muscles for the mud puppy. They're similar to that of the dogfish shark. Both the adductor or levator mandibular externus and anterior are muscles that help elevate the lower jaw, closing the mouth. So the anterior is here, and the externus is here. Then there is the intermandibularis that elevates the throat. That will be located underneath here, which would be right here. The muscle that depresses the lower jaw, opening the mouth, is the depressor mandibulae. Those are going to be located in here in that like crevice. Next we have is the bronchiohyoides that helps retract the hyoid apparatus, while the interhyoides, which would be here, elevates the throat. The brachiohyoides would be located right here. It's that big muscle. The levitator arcuculum is going to be up in here, right around this area. That is responsible for the gill elevator. As you can see in these muscles, they do very similar things between that and the shark, if not the same actions. And all of these structures between the two are homologous in the visceral arc 1 region of the shark, and these two adductor muscles, mandibular anterior and externus of the mud puppy. In these next couple of videos, we're going to be talking about and comparing the gills of the lamprey, the dogfish shark, and the mud puppy. Starting off, we're going to talk about the lamprey. So the respiratory tube gets shut off by the velum flap, so no food will enter the respiratory system. It is pierced by the 7 internal gill slits, each of which lead to bronchial pouch, which go then to the external gill slits. So here you can see these 7 internal gill slits. Each one has their own bronchial pouch. They get really close in here, so it'll focus. You're able to see the gill filaments within the pouches, and that is where the gaseous exchange happens. So it goes from the gill slits, internal gill slits, bronchial pouch, and then these are the 7 external gill slits. Next we have the dogfish shark. The oral cavity is a space of the mouth of the shark. This leads to the pharynx, which is the space that extends from the spiracle to the beginning of the esophagus. The spiracle, which is over here, this helps take in water and ventilate the gills, as well as the other 5 internal gill slits here, that they all pierce the pharynx. That is where you will get your gill rakers projecting from those gill arches in there. Those prevent the food particles from clogging the gill chambers. And then you have the primary lamellae. They're also known as gill filaments. They are intricate structures with large surface areas, and then the secondary lamellae come off of those primary lamellae. Those contain the blood capillaries, so when counter-current exchange occurs, that is where that gaseous exchange will happen. To add to the shark, I just wanted to make sure I quick pointed out these 7 external gill slits. We are now going to talk about the gills of the mud puppy. The mud puppy has well-developed lips that are going to border the oral cavity, which is the space of the mouth. The tongue of the mud puppy is not much more well-developed than the shark's. Posterior to this will be where the pharynx is. And while the shark's gills are internal, the mud puppies are external. They have these 3 bushy parts, and those are going to be the external gills. And then there's a gill slit that occurs between the first and the second gills, and another between the second and the third. And those allow water to be expelled from the pharyngeal cavity. There's also the glottis, which is a small longitudinal slit that goes to the larynx, then to the trachea. And from the trachea, it branches into 2 pairs of short bronchi.
and that's where it goes to the lungs. So this will be the gills of the mud puppy. And then just to finish, I'm going to talk about just some highlights of the similarities between these three species. They all have some sort of use of gill slits, whether it be internal or external. For the lamprey and the shark, they both have those internal gills, while the mud puppy is going to have the external gills. Between the shark and the mud puppy, they both have those underdeveloped tongues that are very similar to one another. Also, you can just kind of note that most of these structures have a similar use, and they have similar structures that are all homologous to one another.